Okay, so you're tuning in because you want to really get a handle on what's happening between the U.S. and China, right?
Yeah.
Forget the sort of surface level news headlines for a minute.
Uh-huh.
This deep dive is really about unpacking the core strategies,
Yeah.
the thinking behind this 21st century power struggle.
It's definitely more than just trade figures.
Exactly. We're talking ideologies, different, well, fundamentally different ways of seeing the world, aren't we? Shaped by, centuries of history.
That's absolutely right. It's easy to get lost in the day-to-day noise, the back and forth.
Yeah.
But if you kind of pull back, you see this much deeper, much more deliberate contest going on.
Right.
You've got the U.S. with its emphasis on, well, liberal capitalism, hard military power, often quite direct confrontation.
Yeah, the sort of established playbook, maybe.
Kind of. And then China, on the other hand, it seems like they're drawing from a much older, well,
Yeah.
prioritizing things like balance, harmony, and achieving goals much more indirectly.
And that's what really jumped out from our sources, wasn't it? This idea that China isn't necessarily playing the same game.
Not at all.
Their approach feels rooted in something, well, ancient, a strategic playbook that really emphasizes subtlety over, brute force.
And that playbook is, of course, Sun Tzu's Art of War.
Exactly. So our mission today, really, is to understand how this ancient strategic thought, we're talking what, around 500 BC?
Roughly, yeah. Eastern Zoo period.
How that thinking continues to shape China's actions today, especially, in this economic competition with the United States.
It's quite remarkable, actually, how relevant these age-old principles still seem to be. The sources really highlight that connection.
It really is, because when you think about it, Sun Tzu, his perspective on conflict was just so different from, say, Clausewitz, the big Western military thinker.
Total different emphasis.
Yeah, Clausewitz saw war as, like, politics by other means, using force directly. But Sun Tzu, he saw war as something to be, well, avoided if you possibly could.
Right. Victory through other means. That was the highest form.
Manipulation, alliances, using leverage, timing. That was the ideal, wasn't it? Not the big decisive battle necessarily.
And you can really see the philosophical underpinnings there, the Taoist and Confucian ideas.
Yeah.
This emphasis on achieving harmony, on really deeply understanding your opponent, their strengths, their weaknesses, and maybe above all, preserving your own strength. Don't deplete yourself needlessly.
Okay, so let's dive into that, those foundational ideas. What are the core philosophical principles driving China's strategy in this long-term competition?
Well, at its heart, you've got a strategic culture that's been shaped by, over 2,000 years of continuous history.
That's a long time.
It really is. And there's this deep-seated priority for continuity, for endurance, and a strong tendency to avoid direct head-on conflict if there's another way.
Sun Tzu's supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting.
That's the one. And it's not just like a nice quote. It seems to be a real guiding principle, which, as you said, is quite different from a lot of Western military thinking that often values those decisive battles.
Okay, so if they're avoiding the big dramatic clashes, how does that actually play out? How do they apply that principle when dealing with a major power like the U.S. today?
Well, we see it in this focus on building resilience across multiple fronts. Take China's dual circulation strategy, for instance.
Right, we read about that.
Think of it like building an internal economic fortress. So even if external things happen, like U.S. sanctions or tariffs, their domestic economy, their internal circulation can kind of keep chugging along. It's like securing your own base first, right, before you engage the enemy. That's pure Sun Tzu.
Makes sense. What else?
They're also doing things like strategic stockpiling of essential resources, developing their own tech alternatives, trying to cut that reliance on Western tech.
De-Americanizing the tech stack, basically.
Exactly. And even building parallel financial systems, like CIPS, their alternative to SWIFT.
Yeah.
These aren't overtly aggressive military moves,
Yeah.
but they build this really significant buffer. They reduce vulnerability to outside pressure.
Okay, so it's about making themselves less vulnerable, shoring up their own position. Now, there was this other concept the sources brought up, SHI, S-H-I. It was described as, like, manipulating potential energy. Can you break that down a bit?
Yeah, she is a really fascinating and quite subtle concept. Think of it like water building up behind a dam.
Okay.
It's not actively flowing and crashing down yet, but it holds immense potential energy, right? A latent power.
Right.
China's strategic investments, things like the Belt and Road Initiative, massive infrastructure projects, pushing ahead in key technologies.
Right.
It's like they're building up that potential, that
creating this positional advantage.
Exactly. It's about shaping the environment, focusing on logistics, information control, building industrial capacity, even influencing regulatory standards. They're constructing this advantage so that when the time is right, or if a situation develops, they're already in a strong position.
Without necessarily having had a direct fight to get there?
Precisely. It might make direct confrontation less necessary or maybe strategically unwise for the opponent. It allows them to exert influence without, the high risks of direct military clashes. It serves those long-term goals better.
Okay, so building momentum, getting into a strong position without necessarily being the first one to throw a punch. Now, another idea that kept coming up was strategic patience. How does that fit with Sun Tzu?
Oh, strategic patience is absolutely critical, and it ties directly back to Sun Tzu's warnings, right? Don't fight on the enemy's terms. Don't fight on their timeline.
Right.
There's that famous quote, when you are strong, appear weak. When you are near, make it seem you are far away.
So it's about masking your real strength or intentions?
Partly, yes. And also about not being rushed into action. China has often seemed willing to absorb what look like short-term setbacks, take the U.S. tariffs, for example.
Yeah, the immediate reaction in the West might have been expecting this huge immediate retaliation.
Exactly. But that wasn't really China's primary response, was it?
No, it was more measured.
Right. They absorbed some of those costs. They actively looked for new trading partners. You saw a big push towards the global south, strengthening ties within Asia through RCEP.
Right, diversifying.
Diversifying, exactly. And crucially, doubling down on investment in those key strategic technologies we mentioned. It wasn't about an immediate tit-for-tat escalation everywhere. It was more like, okay, weather this immediate pressure, but adjust the long-term course.
And they used other levers too, didn't they? Like currency adjustments, capital controls.
Oh, yeah. Subtle pressures. Currency depreciation, keeping tight control over capital flows, pouring state subsidies into those future critical sectors, EV batteries, AI, quantum computing, space tech.
It really highlights the difference in timeframes, doesn't it? The U.S. focus often seems tied to, election cycles, quarterly reports.
Shorter-term wins, yeah. Whereas China, with its 5-year plans, its 30-year infrastructure visions, they're clearly playing a much, much longer game. Patience is built into the system.
And this long game, according to the sources, is increasingly being played out on what they call the economic terrain. That's not about tanks and trenches anymore, is it?
Not primarily, no. In the 21st century, the really crucial terrain, you could argue, is stuff like global supply chains.
Right.
Energy corridors, pipelines, shipping routes, digital infrastructure, undersea cables, 5G networks, strategic sea lanes. These are the battlegrounds now.
So just like Sun Tzu talked about understanding physical terrain, mountains, rivers, choke points.
Exactly. China is applying that same logic to this economic and digital landscape. And they're actively trying to shape it through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
And the Digital Silk Road, the DSR.
Precisely. Financing and building ports. Think Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Djibouti, even Piraeus in Greece, laying undersea internet cables. It's about building the infrastructure of the future economy.
But it's not just like altruistic development aid, is it? There's a strategic angle.
Oh, absolutely. It's deeply strategic. It creates this web of interdependencies, right? It expands China's influence. It potentially makes it more costly, more complex for other countries to push back against Beijing's interests down the line.
And their role as a major creditor nation, especially in the global south.
That's huge leverage. It gives them sway in trade talks, access for investments, sometimes technology sharing agreements. It can even potentially peel away support from traditional U.S. allies who see economic benefits in cooperating with China.
We saw examples during the trade war, didn't we? Like China shifting where it bought its soybeans away from the U.S.
Moving towards Brazil and Argentina, that's adapting to the terrain, finding alternative routes when one path is blocked or becomes too costly.
And things like cross-border e-commerce, bypassing some traditional channels.
Another example, constantly maneuvering, finding those alternative pathways. It really brings that Sun Tzu principle, know the terrain and your victory will be assured, right into the modern economic sphere. It's about understanding and shaping the flows of goods, capital, and data.
Okay, now let's shift to something a bit more, well, subtle. Maybe even Machiavellian, some might say. Sun Tzu's idea of dividing your enemy.
Ah, yes. If your enemy is united, divide them. That's a classic.
How does China apply that in its relationship with the U.S., which is obviously complex and often divided internally anyway?
Well, they seemed quite adept at tactfully exploiting those existing divisions within the U.S.
Like what?
The intense political polarization between parties, for one, but also the different priorities of various industries, different lobbying groups, even the distinct economic interests of individual states versus others.
The sources pointed to that example during the trade war, how China specifically targeted agricultural exports.
Right.
Coming from states that were, strong bases of support for the Trump administration. That felt very deliberate.
Oh, it was highly calculated, you'd have to assume.
Mm-hmm.
While the overall economic hit to the U.S. might not have been crippling from just those tariffs, the political impact was significant. It created pressure from within the U.S. system. You had farmers, agricultural businesses lobbying hard for a resolution because they were feeling the pain directly.
And they do similar things with corporations too, right? Treating some differently than others.
Yeah, that's another tactic.
Yeah.
Offering, say, exemptions or better market access to some U.S. companies, Tesla is often cited as an example.
Right.
While simultaneously putting restrictions or pressure on others, maybe those linked to the defense sector or critical technologies, what does that do?
It splits the business community.
Exactly. It makes it much harder for American businesses to present a single, unified front against China's policies.
Right.
It creates different incentives for different players.
And it wasn't just economic pressure, was it? The sources also mentioned using, diplomatic back channels, even social media.
To amplify existing divisions, highlighting things like job losses, potentially linked to the trade war in certain regions, or rising consumer prices, or the strain the tensions were putting on U.S. alliances.
So sowing doubt, creating hesitation.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
It's a form of psychological warfare, you could say.
Yeah.
Trying to weaken the opponent's resolve, create confusion, make policymaking more difficult, all without firing a shot, going back to that core Sun Tzu idea.
Which leads us nicely into another key Sun Tzu concept. Deception. Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. How does that manifest in this big U.S.-China dynamic?
Deception, or maybe strategic ambiguity, is absolutely fundamental.
Right.
We see China employing this through carefully managed public statements, through their rhetoric.
How so?
Well, they often seem to oscillate, don't they? Between appearing quite conciliatory, willing to talk, wanting cooperation, and then suddenly taking a much more assertive or hawkish stance on certain issues. It makes it really difficult for the U.S. or anyone to consistently predict their next move or their true intentions.
So keeping the opponent off balance.
Exactly. They might publicly agree to, say, a partial trade deal, or participate actively in the WTO and other international forums.
Right, looking like they're playing by the established rules.
While simultaneously, and maybe more quietly, they're accelerating their own long-term goals, like pushing for technological self-reliance, building up those internal systems we talked about.
The Phase 1 trade agreement felt a bit like that, didn't it? It was announced with big fanfare.
Huge fanfare, big promises on purchases.
But then the actual purchase numbers, according to many reports, didn't fully materialize as promised.
Precisely. So, while publicly they made these commitments, potentially easing immediate tensions, the focus internally seems to have remained squarely on that dual circulation strategy, on de-Americanizing key tech sectors.
So it's about managing expectations.
Yeah, using the opponent's expectations to create a somewhat predictable response from them while you're actually preparing or pursuing a different path underneath. It's a form of strategic camouflage, maybe.
Okay. Now let's talk about something more tangible, a real source of leverage. The global supply chain. The sources suggest this can be seen almost as a modern weapon.
It's definitely a critical strategic dimension. China's position as the world's factory has created this incredibly deep web of dependencies, both ways, of course, but their dominance in certain areas is significant.
It's not just an economic fact anymore.
No, it's a strategic asset. By holding these key positions in global supply chains, especially for critical stuff like rare earth minerals.
Yeah, essential for so much modern tech.
Absolutely. Or essential medical supplies, as we saw during the pandemic. Certain electronic components. Having that dominant position gives them potential leverage, potential pressure points.
We saw hints of that with rare earths a few years back, didn't we? And more recently, those announced export restrictions on materials like graphite and gallium.
Exactly. Even if they don't implement a full-scale long-term ban, just the suggestion, the strategic signaling.
Right, it sends ripples.
It creates concern. even panic buying in some industries. It forces other countries, other companies, to urgently reevaluate how dependent they are on Chinese suppliers for these critical inputs.
And at the same time, China's pouring money into its own domestic capabilities in these areas, right?
Absolutely. Subsidizing domestic players like SMIC and semiconductors, pushing for alternatives to dominant Western software. It's about increasing their own self-sufficiency while also highlighting the vulnerabilities of others. It connects back to Sun Tzu's advice to, strike where the enemy is unprepared, in this case, potentially undermining the West's reliance on just-in-time, globally dispersed supply models.
Okay, so moving beyond the sort of hard economic and political moves, there's also this crucial battle for narrative, for soft power. Sun Tzu talks about winning before you even fight, right?
Yeah.
Shaping the psychological landscape.
Absolutely. And China has made, really significant investments in shaping international perceptions.
What kind of thing?
Through their state-backed global media outlets like CGTN and Xinhua. Through cultural initiatives like the Confucius Institutes, though those have become more controversial, and through active engagement in international organizations trying to influence norms and standards from within.
And how did they use this during, say, the height of the trade tensions?
They consistently work to portray themselves as the rational actor,
Yeah.
the champion of globalization and multilateralism.
Contrasting themselves with the U.S.
Exactly. Painting the U.S. approach under Trump, for example, as more unilateral, protectionist, even isolationist, trying to win the narrative war on the global stage.
Hosting big global forums, talking up globalization at places like Davos.
Right. Promoting the yuan, encouraging CSR initiatives and tech partnerships through giants like Alibaba and Huawei before the restrictions hit them hard. It's all part of building that image.
And their actions during the COVID-19 pandemic, the so-called mass diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, did that fit in?
Oh, definitely. That was seen by many analysts as a clear extension of this soft power strategy, positioning China as a responsible global power, providing essential goods when others couldn't or wouldn't, especially in the global south.
So building goodwill, creating that perception of China as a reliable partner, may be an alternative to Western influence.
Precisely. It's about winning hearts and minds, which, in the long run, can be just as important as economic leverage or military strength.
Okay, looking even further ahead now, the competition seems increasingly focused on technology, doesn't it? The future tech battlefield.
Without a doubt, the race for leadership in AI, quantum computing, biotech, clean energy, 6G, this is absolutely central to the future balance of power.
And we see different strategies here, too. The U.S. has used containment, more sanctions, blacklists.
Right, trying to restrict China's access to key technologies or components.
But China's response, according to the sources, seems almost Sun Tzu-like, using that pressure.
It really does. It's like using the opponent's force against them. Instead of buckling under the pressure, China appears to have used those restrictions as a powerful motivator, a catalyst for accelerating its own push for domestic innovation and self-reliance.
We saw that so clearly with semiconductors, didn't we? After the U.S. put restrictions on Huawei, on SMIC.
Boom. Massive state funding poured in. That big fund initiative for apps was enormous. It's like they said, okay, if you won't sell it to us, we will learn to make it ourselves and faster.
So turning a perceived weakness, a dependency, into a driver for building internal strength.
Exactly. And it's not just about catching up anymore. China is also actively trying to get out ahead in setting global technical standards in these new fields.
Why is that so important? Setting standards.
Because whoever sets the standards for smart cities, for facial recognition AI, for future communication networks, through bodies like the ITU or ISO, essentially shapes the rules of the game for everyone else.
Ah, okay. It locks people into your ecosystem.
It influences future technology development, market access, data governance, everything. It's another way of shaping the battlefield before the major conflicts even fully emerge. Very strategic, very Sun Tzu.
Okay, one last major area the sources highlighted, the financial system. There's this long-term goal, it seems, for China to reduce the dominance of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah, that's definitely a long-term strategic objective. And you see the Sun Tzu connection. Again, he warned against protracted wars because they drain resources, right?
Uh-huh.
Well, America's global power is deeply, deeply intertwined with the dollar's role as the world's main reserve currency. It gives the U.S. enormous financial leverage.
So China wants to chip away at that. How?
A key move is the development and rollout of the digital yuan, the ECNY. It's one of the world's first major central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, already in mass trials.
And the significance of that.
Potentially huge.
Sure.
It could, down the line, allow international transactions to happen outside the existing SWIFT system.
Which is heavily U.S. influenced and the pipeline for sanctions.
Exactly. So a digital yuan could facilitate trade settled directly in yuan,
Yeah.
bypassing the dollar system and U.S. oversight or potential sanctions.
Yeah.
It helps internationalize the yuan.
And we're already seeing more countries doing bilateral currency swaps with China.
Yes.
And settling trade in yuan, not dollars.
Yes, that's happening more and more, especially with countries like Russia, Iran, some Gulf states, nations participating in the BRI. It's a gradual strategy.
Not trying to replace the dollar overnight.
No, the dollar is still dominant. But it's about creating alternatives, fragmenting the system, reducing reliance. It's about seeing the opportunity in what Sun Tzu called chaos, perhaps perceiving U.S. financial overreach or the weaponization of the dollar as an opening to build their own parallel, more sovereign system over time.
Okay, so if we try and pull all these threads together, especially looking towards, say, 2025 as the sources speculate, we might see China doing things like strategically restricting exports of key materials like rare earths or magnets, maybe.
Potentially, yeah. Using that supply chain leverage. Maybe preparing alternatives just for friendly buyers, creating a two-tiered system. That's terrain denial.
While at the same time, keeping up this facade of diplomatic engagement, ASEAN talks, investment summits.
Right. Strategic ambiguity. Talk peace while preparing for something else. Masking the acceleration of yuan-settled trade, support for indigenous tech, causing confusion in Western policy circles.
And continuing that psychological campaign. Framing the U.S. as protectionist, maybe winning sympathy via the digital Silk Road or ongoing vaccine diplomacy.
Using soft power, shaping the narrative? Absolutely. Portraying themselves as the stable, reliable alternative.
And working to undermine U.S. alliances, maybe using economic diplomacy with countries like Germany, France, South Korea, offering market access if they waver on decoupling.
That fits the divide the enemy playbook. Deepening ties with Russia, BRICS plus poor, creating counterweights to U.S.-led coalitions, fracturing the opposition.
And maybe even subtly triggering market anxiety in the U.S. Hints about selling treasuries or delisting firms without necessarily doing it on a massive scale.
Using the enemy's own momentum, their financial fragility, their investor uncertainty, their deficits to create instability, exploiting those vulnerabilities without a direct attack. All classic Sun Tzu applications in a modern context.
Wow. So when you put it all together like that,
Yeah.
the picture that emerges is that this U.S.-China trade war or competition, it's really not a conventional conflict at all, is it?
Not in the traditional sense, no. It's much more like a long-term campaign of strategic influence, economic maneuvering, narrative control, technological competition, and maybe even a degree of subversion. And as our sources really drive home, China's approach seems deeply informed by these ancient Sun Tzu principles.
So the key takeaway then for you, our listener, is that really understanding this competition means looking way beyond the daily headlines and the tariff announcements. It's about recognizing this fundamentally different approach to wielding power on the global stage. One that prioritizes patience, indirect influence, shaping perceptions, controlling the economic terrain, and turning adversity into advantage.
It contrasts sharply with approaches that might rely more on blunt instruments or seeking quick, decisive outcomes. China's strategy, informed by Sun Tzu, isn't really about rapid conquest. It's about the long, slow, deliberate rebalancing of global power and ensuring control over its own destiny.
And that patience we talked about, it's not passive waiting, is it? It's calculated action, constant adjustment.
Exactly. It's a continuous process, leveraging every interaction, every development to gradually build advantage over the very long term. A persistent shift, not a sudden shock.
It certainly gives you a whole new framework for thinking about these massive global shifts. And maybe, just maybe, a final thought for you to ponder. How might these ancient Chinese strategic ideas, this focus on indirect influence, understanding the terrain, strategic patience, knowing your opponent, winning without fighting, how might they apply beyond geopolitics? Could you see echoes in complex business negotiations? Or even in developing your own personal strategies for reaching important long-term goals? It's definitely a fascinating lens to think about as you navigate the complexities of your own world.